Okay, on to B.F. Skinner. This is the third piece. I had to leave for a moment, so sorry. On to B.F. Skinner. A couple of pictures of B.F. Skinner. One of the left, obviously, is early in his career. One to the right just struck me as a very unusual kind of picture. He looked very. He has a kind of a smirk on his face. He actually reminded me on the next picture of Lloyd Bridges in Airplane when the guy says, "I picked the wrong week to stop sniffing glue." And when I mentioned that to my partner, she was aghast that I would even insinuate that B.F. Skinner might sniff glue. When I said I don't think he was sniffing glue, but anyway, he's got kind of an interesting look on his face on the picture to the right, where he's a bit older. You can tell that that was a man with one hell of a big cranium, so he had to house a substantial brain matter in somewhere, and he's got a big old noggin. So, where to start or begin or end with B.F. Skinner? A little bit of background on Skinner. His B.F. stands for Burrhus Frederick. Burrhus is B-U-R-R-H-U-S. I wish I had another Snoop Dogg or some sort of similar reference to that, but I don't know anybody else who's famous or that I can think of who has the name Burrhus in any place in his or her name. As I mentioned before, Skinner is one of the most famous psychologists, really, of all time. Certainly one of the most influential, probably one of the top 2 or 3 most influential, really, of the 20th century as a whole. Certainly of the second half of the 20th century. I think there's no question about that. Skinner got his PhD from Harvard, was a professor at the University of Minnesota for quite some time, which was actually a very good gig back in the day. People often think, well, Minnesota doesn't seem like it's all that impressive. University of Minnesota had a number of very important psychologists working there, and was also the place that the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, was developed. MMPI is the granddaddy or the grandparent of all personality tests. Now, Skinner didn't have anything to do with that, but what I'm saying is Minnesota was a good job. But he leaves Minnesota to go get a job at Harvard, and he stays at Harvard for the rest of his career. Skinner died in 1990 as a result of leukemia, but he lived, again, a very full life. I believe he lived into his 80s. And as we'll see at the end of this piece, he was a cantankerous kind of sort. He finished an article, I think, the night that he died, or the night before that he passed away, on why psychology was going down the wrong road. And so even into his 70s and 80s, he was very kind of opinionated, very strong-willed. Skinner's attributed to what we refer to as radical behaviorism, although many people talk about Watson as being a radical behaviorist as well. For Skinner, the mantra that I use is many of few, not few of many. And what that means is that if you remember back to your experimental psychology course, or any type of experimental course that you've taken in one of the sciences, the emphasis often is in quantitative statistics is having a large N, having a number of participants in your research. But that comes at the cost of not being able to get a lot of information, or a lot of in-depth information necessarily, about each individual. And that has to do with things like external validity and ability to generalize to kind of other populations and so on, which we don't need to get into. Skinner wasn't as much of a fan of that. Skinner's approach was to have a small number of participants of research, and that very often was animal research, but to run them through multitudes and multitudes of trials so that you got a lot of information about behavior, about how behavior developed, how it changed, ideas of generalization and reinforcement schedules and so on. And so that's the many of few. He may have had few research participants, but he put them through many trials to get information. So it's a different take on quantitative statistics in many ways. he did most of his research with, he did a lot of research with pigeons, also did a lot of research with rats, and he tended to be very hardcore about his behavioral approach. So he was very strict on his methodology, which is excellent for research purposes. He tended to be very application-based, which is one of the things I think that endeared him to the American public as a whole, and certainly to American psychology. So, for example, he developed a system for the Army in World War II where pigeons would actually be able to attend to missile guidance systems. And most people would say that's crazy, you can't trust birds to do things. Well, what they would do is they had it set up where the pigeons would have to peck in a particular order, and when they did, they would get a food pellet. Well, if the food pellet is reinforcing, the pigeons can, quote-unquote, remember or engage in a behavior to peck certain things in a certain order to make sure that the missiles are fired correctly. And generally speaking, that replaced, the idea was it would replace humans to some extent, which would help save human lives in case the planes were shot down. Now, it wasn't used very heavily because by the time that he had come up with it, we were engaged in a different kind of level of warfare. But it was, this was a very, I mean, he was hired by the armed forces, the United States Armed Forces, to develop programs using animals to do things exactly like this. He also had a very heavy influence on education, and was a bit of a tinker and inventor as well, but you don't have to know that for your exam. If you're interested in doing a paper on him, you can kind of follow up that piece of his life as well. We're going to talk about reinforcement and punishment in a moment, but Skinner is, because those tend to be two of the kind of hardcore pieces of operant conditioning. For the record, in my readings, and my partner Nicole kind of backed this up through her readings, which are far more extensive, while Skinner recognized the tenets and certainly the value of reinforcement and punishment, he certainly was much more of pro-reinforcement and anti-punishment than often he's made out to be. So he wasn't, it's not that he didn't feel that punishment worked, he just felt that using reinforcement was a much better way to get people or animals to engage in behaviors. Ooh, need a little beverage there. Okay. Operant conditioning. In many ways, this is akin to Thorndike's puzzle box work, but it's much more delineated. It's much more kind of well thought and explicated. And it's in the end, operant conditioning is really about prediction and control, similar to Watson's work and Watson's attempt to work on prediction and control. But Skinner recognized the value of reinforcement in kind of combining Watson's work and Thorndike's work as well as some other people's work. And essentially comes down to two pieces where it says on your slide, two axes, draw box, Dan. Well, I drew a box, and I'm going to put it up for you to look at so that you can see it briefly. There it is. What we have here is a 2x2 kind of grid where the R stands for reinforcement and the P stands for punishment. Positive stands for positive or the presentation of something, and negative, the minus sign stands for negative or the removal of something. Okay? And we'll talk about each one of these in a moment. But basically, once you kind of recognize what reinforcement and punishment are, what positive and negative mean, you can understand what each one of these means in combination. So we'll go over that briefly. Reinforcement is essentially anything that either increases or maintains a behavior. Okay, so reinforcement increases or maintains a behavior. Some people say it's intended to, but there are naturally occurring things, whether they're intentional or not, that increase or maintain behaviors. So reinforcement is meant to increase or maintain behavior. Punishment, on the other hand, is meant to decrease or eliminate behavior. Okay? So punishment decreases or eliminates behavior. So that's the one axis. The second axis is positive versus negative. And in this case, positive doesn't mean anything about good, and negative doesn't necessarily mean anything about bad. Positive simply means the presentation of something, okay? And negative means the removal of something. And so when we combine those two kind of axes into that box that we saw earlier, which I'll put up again just so you can see it, we come up with four possible combinations. Okay? The first is positive reinforcement. And by going through the pieces, that means positive means the presentation of, and reinforcement means increasing and maintaining a behavior. Essentially what positive reinforcement is, the presentation of some stimulus that is meant to increase or maintain a behavior. Okay? For the purposes of positive reinforcement, the stimulus is referred to generally as appetitive. And that means it's something that people or animals prefer, enjoy, that they would want. So the presentation of something that you want in order to get you to increase or maintain some behavior. And the classic idea is that is a reward. If you do this, then I'll give you that. So the idea is that over time, people engage in the behavior because they are getting something that they want. Okay? And that will keep you doing that behavior, or it will increase the amount of behavior that you demonstrate. Okay? So that's positive reinforcement. There's also negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus in the hopes that you will continue or increase a behavior. So you still have the reinforcement piece where you're meant to increase or maintain behavior. But here we're talking about the removal of something. Okay? And that's from the negative piece. Negative reinforcement often is a little more difficult to explain for people, and that's because negative reinforcement is almost directly related to punishment in some form, usually positive punishment. My partner spent a good portion of her 120 some odd page master's thesis investigating the effects of negative reinforcement. And so for those of you who are incredibly interested in it, let me know, and I'm sure she would regale you with any host of pieces of information about her thesis and how it happened. But in the absence of that, essentially an example of negative reinforcement is when people are on probation or on restriction. If they engage in more appropriate behaviors, often those negative consequences will be removed in the hopes that they will continue to do the right thing. Okay? You can see how this is related to punishment, because if they're being punished and we're removing the punishment, which we generally refer to as an aversive stimulus, we're removing that, well, then they're more likely, hopefully, to keep doing that. So I think of, for people that are on probation, they often have to meet with their probation officer. They have to show that they are either gainfully employed or applying for jobs. They have to go and what we refer to as drop urines. So they have to drop urine samples or give urine samples to see if they're come positive for alcohol or drugs. There are a lot of kind of pieces. They have to make sure that their housing is certified as being okay. And then if they do that, over time, either they have to do it less often so that some of the aversion or the aversive stimuli are removed, or they're let off of probation or parole. And that's meant to conceptually be a bonus to them for doing the right things, and hopefully they'll continue to do the right things. Another example of negative reinforcement is essentially when it rains using an umbrella. You engage in a behavior, putting the umbrella up, that's meant to that removes a negative consequence. In other words, it's raining. Raining is generally seen as being kind of the negative consequence. By putting up the umbrella, you remove the negative consequence, and that keeps you actually using the umbrella. You wouldn't use an umbrella if it didn't work, but umbrella use is generally negatively reinforced. By doing it, you remove an aversive stimulus. Okay? The third combination is positive punishment. Again, that's the presentation of something, but in this case, in the hopes that you're going to decrease or eliminate a behavior. Okay? In this case, again, this is the presentation of an aversive stimulus, something that we don't like. And that's the key. It has to be something that the person or the animal doesn't like. A classic example of positive punishment is spanking. You present something that arguably the child doesn't like, in the hopes that the spanking will decrease some behavior or eliminate a behavior, whether that's hitting your brother or sister, or stealing, or talking back, or not doing your chores, or whatever it is. And so you have to make sure that it is an aversive stimulus. If your punishment is spanking someone, but they have a high threshold for pain, or they see it as attention in any form, then it may not be aversive, and they'll continue to engage in it. Which is often why people wonder why children or other people engage in these negative things. You're like, why would they want to do that? Well, because the action may not be as aversive to them as it is to you. It may be that attention is more preferable, has greater preference than the aversion of pain for some people. But that's an example of positive punishment, spanking. You're presenting something that, in this case, is aversive in the hopes that you're going to decrease or eliminate a behavior. And the last piece is negative punishment. Negative punishment is the removal of something, and in this case it's appetite, the removal of something that you prefer, in the hopes that you will decrease or eliminate a certain behavior that is unwanted. The classic example from this is being put on restriction. And so when I was in high school, back in the day before we had the internet, my parents would take away things like maybe phone time, or when I was driving, my allowance to, the agreement that I could drive a car, or that kind of stuff. And that's, those type of restrictions are kind of classic. And so that's the 2x2 kind of grid and the explanation of quick and dirty positive and negative reinforcement, and positive and negative punishment. Now, we're not going to get into things like schedules of behavior, interval versus ratio, and variable versus fixed, and so on. But just kind of give you an overview of Skinner's work regarding punishment and reinforcement. Skinner was also controversial in some of the things that he wrote. I'm going to read you a little overview about a book he wrote called Walden 2. Walden 2 is a utopian novel by behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner. No, you don't have to write all this down, just get the overview of it. And this book describes a small 1,000-person rural planned community of happy, productive, and creative people. Individuals referred to as planners and managers govern a community, requiring only 4 hours a day of work from each person, and that promotes the arts and applied scientific research. The community subscribed to a code of conduct based upon and supported by a behaviorism resembling that of author B.F. Skinner. Walden 2 challenges contemporary U.S. social conventions such as the value of modern education, the effectiveness of university professors, excessive work volume, and posits a planned economy critical of inefficient capitalism. So in many ways, Skinner was taking on a lot of the social institutions, certainly of the United States. And think he wrote this in 1948. This is coming out just after World War II. The United States is really starting to do pretty well as an international force. We're really starting to come into our own and go into the 50s that were kind of seen as the golden age for a lot of people. And so he's taking on a lot of big conceptual institutions here. Walden 2's community government is not democratic. Children are reared communally outside the nuclear family, and loyalty to the community instead of parents is encouraged. This has a very socialist feel to many people, and or a communist feel in some ways, and that was very problematic. Childbearing is encouraged as soon as possible in pursuit of a great growth policy, and eugenics are considered in possibly creating a golden age. Again, we talked about eugenics, that conceptually, from a controlled perspective, it may be appealing, but in a practical sense, beyond the impracticality of it is the ethical piece of it. Walden 2 is controversial for its rejection of democracy as effective government, viable socialist economy, an atheistic society, the narrow range of available emotional expression, and its appeal to dictators and to emulators of the protagonist, a guy named Fraser. So Walden 2 is a very controversial book that he wrote. It was based on, it was his take or his offshoot of Walden, which I believe was written by Milton, about Walden was supposed to be a utopian society, and so for Skinner, he wrote Walden 2 as his version of a utopian society based on behavioral tenets. Skinner also wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which got him in a lot of hot water. It says read from Book Dan, and so I'm going to read this off to you as well. Bear with me. In 1971, Skinner published his most famous book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, a book that made the New York Times bestseller list and landed Skinner on the cover of Time magazine in September of 1971. In the book, he argued that much of people's lives were controlled by other forces, not of their own choosing. He argued that freedom was largely an illusion. It's a pretty big statement, particularly considering we in the United States feel that since we have more freedoms than most, that we we have more freedoms than most. And he's saying that we really don't have as many freedoms as we think. He wasn't necessarily saying it from a heavily political standpoint. It was more a psychological standpoint. And I'll read a little bit more from the book. This was a message that was much misunderstood and certainly not well received. It started with a poor choice of title for the book, something that Skinner later acknowledged. But the principal message got lost in most reviews of the book. Skinner argued that people could not gain some control over their lives until they paid attention to the controls in place and decided what they wanted to do about them. And so in other words, he's saying that there are a number of contexts that actually control our behaviors that we may not even be aware of. And until you're aware of the things that are affecting your behavior, you don't really have nearly as much freedom as you think you do. So we think we're free to do certain things, like we have freedom of speech, but there are certain things that we actually can't do. So whether it's advocating the overthrow of the government or yelling fire in a crowded area, that there are contexts, and those are laws, but there are kind of laws, there are mores, there are social conventions, there are rules from institutions, there are underlying things that affect our behavior that we are often not even aware of. And so Beyond Freedom and Dignity is the only full Skinner book that I read, and it's a little dense to read. Skinner writes in a little of a laden form, not as heavy as the existentialists or something like that, but while he makes some very controversial statements, I agree with him about the idea that there are multiple contexts that affect our behavior that we're not really even aware of, and until we become aware of them, we really don't have the freedoms that we think that we do. As it says on your slide, the last article that B.F. Skinner wrote was called "Can Psychology Be a Science of the Mind?" and he wrote it the night before he died. And true to form, up until the end, this article was largely an attack on cognitive psychology, which he railed against because of what he called the quote-unquote explanatory fictions of cognitive psych. In other words, often metaphor that they used or examples that, again, for his purposes, had to do with these underlying thoughts or cognitions that couldn't be measured in a clean way, certainly not observable like behaviors were. And so he railed against cognitive psychology and what he called a culture of mentalism, which I hear all the time from my partner, because she'll say, that's a very mentalistic explanation, and I'll say, you're right, because I'm not a behaviorist. I believe in behavioral tenets and will utilize many, but I'm not a strict behaviorist, and so I don't have an aversion to using mentalistic explanations for things. But Skinner was very much opposed to it. So that's it for Chapter 8. Hopefully I'll be able to upload these in smaller pieces for you, so you'll get Part 1, 2, and 3 of Chapter 8. Keep your eyes peeled for emails regarding Chapter 9, which will be coming up shortly. Thanks.